Hello! Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cinelit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cinelit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cinelit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Welcome to Cinelit. Today we are returning to the world of crime cinema to look at a run of 6 films by Italian director Sergio Martino. From 1971 to 1975, Sergio directed a handful of the key films in the gialli genre. As we've explained before our Dario Argento podcast, a giallo is a particular brand of crime and mystery thriller that derives its name from the long-running series of paperback fictions released by Italian publishing giant Mondadori. These books, printed in garish yellow covers, were soon nicknamed Giallo, Italian for yellow, and the rest is history. And then in the late 1960s, when filmmakers began adapting some of these books for the big screen, the term transferred over to cinema. Probably one of the 3 or 4 key names in the subgenre, Sergio Martino had a run and left behind some of the timeless examples of the genre, and arguably had a run of quality comparable to the greats of the genre like Mario Bava and Dario Argento. I am your host, Adam Marsh, and donning the black gloves to join us today is Cinelit's resident expert, Daryl Buxton. How are you, Daryl?
I'm good, thanks, Adam. Looking forward to talking about Sergio. I think he's a bit of a sort of underrated and under-discussed figure, and this little batch of films, which forms a particular little knot within his career, is especially interesting.
And again, joining us today to discuss this particularly interesting period of Martino's career is the creator of the British fanzine Giallo Pages, John Martin. How are you?
Buongiorno. Bene, bene.
Very good. That's about all the Italian you're going to get today, other than maybe us butchering some of the titles. That's what we do here. We don't butcher on the films, we butcher titles. So here we're talking about Sergio Martino. Started making his movies in the wake of the big boom of Giallo after Dario Argento released Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which really gave the genre a massive box office hit, really. I was trying to think about how we separate him from Bava and we separate him from Argento, and the lyrics to When Smokey Sings by ABC popped into my head, where he talks about like this person's the originator, this person's the innovator, and Sergio for me is the Smokey Robinson of Giallo. He didn't originate the genre, he wasn't the innovator that Argento was, but there's something about his films that's maybe the heart of the genre. Tell me if I'm wrong here, guys.
When he directs, we see violence.
Exactly, there you go. But he was a hack director in the best possible use of the term. You know, hack is often used as a negative now. I don't see it as a negative. I see it as somebody who can turn their hand to a wide variety of genres and deliver quality within those constraints. And he seemed to be that guy who you wanted a giallo, he'd do you a giallo. He wants a sex comedy, he'd do you an Italian sex comedy. You want a post-apocalyptic sci-fi, no worries, Sergio's your man. You want an adventure set in the Amazon, boom, yeah, here he is again, Sergio Martino. he seemed to be able to turn his hand to lots of different genres and still deliver that high quality.
Yeah, I think in this period as well, Adam, you know, sort of including and incorporating the giallo titles, but the films just before and just after that, there's almost a little sort of cottage industry going on there, because his brother Luciano is producing the films. Luciano's wife, Edwige Fenech, is the star of a lot of the films. George Hilton, who was sort of related to the family by marriage, I think he was married to a cousin or something, is the male lead in a lot of the films. And there's this whole little tight-knit group that's making this almost like, you know, something like the Carry On films or something, in a sense, in that there's this little band of people that get together and make 2 films every year, you know. And I think that comes through in the finished product, you know. It's there is a sign that, you know, they're commercial and entertaining films, and films that look like everybody else's films to a point. But there is this sense of sort of community and fun within them, you know, like you get in a film franchise. These aren't a franchise as such, but they almost play as though they are. And I think if you know the background and you get to recognise the actors and you get to recognise some of the names in the credits, I think that these films are nice to watch in a little batch together.
Yeah, and effectively another member of the family is the writer Ernesto Castaldi, who wrote all of the films I think we're going to mainly talk about today. And he is a writer who was obsessed with Clouseau's L'Œil Diabolique and working out the various permutations of who's fooling who, who's killing who's making love to whom. And but in every film it's different. It's the same, but it's different, to coin a phrase. And it's a fascinating little body of work.
I find Gastaldi's input into these films fascinating, because you have, obviously, you've got Bava, who kick-started the whole genre with a handful of movies in the 60s. And then you've got Argento, who increasingly seemed less interested in the plot and the mechanics of a giallo and more interested in the visuals of the giallo. And you've got Sergio Martino in the middle, with almost forensic detail from Castaldi in the mechanics of the plot, which is one of my favourite things about giallo movies, is the almost ridiculously complicated plot, I guess. They're almost needlessly complicated. And that's what I love about those songs. And when people do modern versions of giallo, that's the thing that they junk out straight away.
Yeah.
It's always the visuals, it's always the look of those films, it's the black love killer, it's those kind of like, imagery that they bring to their reinvention. I'm waiting for those ones that has that ridiculous plotting all the way through to be done. But that's what I love about these movies.
Castaldi is a real purist. He said to me that he didn't believe Argento had ever directed a giallo because he has a very strict definition of what a giallo is, including playing fair with the viewer about the identity of the killer, which I think we'd all admit is not a strong point of Argento's.
No, not at all. I mean, it doesn't seem to interest Argento, whereas in Martino, that's the thing he seems to focus on. And you do get great visuals, you do get the great sense of foreboding and the sort of like over-the-shoulder camera of the killer, but he seems much more interested in telling that story and making sure that the reveal at the end is satisfying for his audience.
Yeah, I think one thing about Martino's films in that sense is that the plots actually make sense of a sort, and that's partly down to Gastaldi's writing and partly down to the way that Martino films them. As you've used the word forensic there, Adam, and I think that's very apt, because that's the way he seems to approach his filmmaking, certainly in this subgenre. I think the plots are so complicated that if you as a viewer take your eye off the ball momentarily, you can lose track of what's going on. But if you really, really concentrate on a Sergio Martino film, that concentration will be rewarded by the end. Even if outrageous ideas are introduced quite late in the plot, as they often are in Gastaldi scripts, they sort of make sense. They sort of repay the committed and attentive viewer, I think. And Martino does that probably better than any other Italian director. It's easy for a director to lose their way when they're making this particular type of crime cum horror thriller. The scripts are often so complicated that even the filmmakers can sort of lose a grasp of them, and it's a thing that Martino never ever does. He's always in complete control, I think.
Although these things are often so rigidly plotted by Castaldi, who was a real stickler for these things, the one film that seems to me to have some element of ambivalence at the end is All the Colours of the Dark, where it's suggested that Edwige Fenech is perhaps gifted with some psychic, witchy powers, and that this is something awakening inside her over and above any more mundane stuff people were doing to inherit money. And that ambivalence is really interesting. I can watch that again and again and again because characters' backs are turned to you and you can hear them speaking. It's obviously been overdubbed later. It's like they're trying to resolve this ambivalence, or maybe something arose during the making of the film they wanted to fix. And it even, the sort of, is she mad, or are these occult powers real? It's kind of suggested earlier where Fenech is such an uptight character and she's so repressed, and her friend says to her, hey, you could solve all your problems by going to a black mass, and she says, hey, yeah, let's do it now, which is crazy. So it doesn't quite stack up, but it's a really interesting tension, and I think it paves the way for something like Suspiria, which is a mixture of giallo and supernatural film,
Yeah, I think within this body of work as well, it sort of sets, as we've said, the 6 films are all different from each other. Interestingly, even though they're all based on Castaldi scripts and they're all centred around the sort of giallo subgenre, they're all very, very different and individual from each other, unlike some other filmmakers like Umberto Lenzi, who just seem to make the same giallo time after time under different titles. So if this one does have a hint of the supernatural to it, I think that distinguishes it from the other 5 movies in this period. Also, although it's clearly inspired by the likes of Rosemary's Baby and this vein of sort of supernatural conspiracy movie that was around at the time, it in turn may well be a film that has had an influence on the sort of recent run of what is termed elevated horror. I think if you look at the films of Ari Aster or even Guadagnino's Suspiria remake, the endings of all of those films have this type of ending. There is this suggestion that the lead character that we've been following all the way through the film is some kind of god or goddess or something, and they don't know it. And I think that seems to sort of stem from All the Colours of the Dark.
But not nearly as much fun in those movies.
No, it isn't.
There's not a lot of fun in the Suspiria remake.
And twice the length,
No, not at all, no. But what do you think the reason was for that then? Because we talked about how each one is very, very different. But he has come from that, like you said, a cottage industry. They're making these films to make money. And usually when you have a hit, you rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. Yet he doesn't do that, despite the reason for them setting up is the whole point is to make money. Maybe they were making so much money off the Italian sex comedies that they were making that they could be a bit more free and easy with these ones. I don't know.
When I interviewed him, he talked about the ruthless logic of commercial production, and that was, set in stone. But also, he said he never wanted to repeat himself. And I think one of the ones he was least happy with was the Case of the Scorpion's Tail, because he felt like that was a bit of a rehash of Mrs. Ward without Edwige Fenech. And then he really set off after that and made some, wildly varied stuff.
Yeah, I think Case of the Scorpion's Tail is a great standalone film, but watched within this batch of films, it is the one that looks the most sort of tired and the most sort of generic. And as you say, it does sort of repeat many elements of the plot of Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward. But,
well, they didn't mess around, did they? It was released in the same calendar year as Ward, so they weren't messing around. They cranked another one out, didn't they?
But as you say, Adam, it's interesting that the films were so different when they didn't have to do that. So it's obviously a conscious choice. And I wonder if, John, you're suggesting that maybe Martino wanted to do that, didn't want to repeat himself. Castaldi was churning out the same script year after year for different directors. Maybe everything just came to a head here in 1971 and 72, and the whole little collective sort of maybe discussed between them. You can imagine them all sat around one of those great Italian tables,
with the vino
piled
flowing,
up with
yeah.
pasta and so on, and saying, let's actually not film the same script 3 or 4 times, and come up with a bit of variety. I don't know if it was even that planned. It may have just happened organically, but it is unusual within the Italian industry, which was so much based on churning out product. If you look at things like the spaghetti westerns, for instance, or the later sort of crime thrillers and police movies, you tended to see the same plots time after time. This is what makes this such an interesting little batch of films, I think. Yeah. The fact that they are so different.
People talk about Martino as a craftsman rather than an auteur, but I think maybe the auteurism, maybe his personality, is having this variety of stuff coming from a screenwriter whose obsessions just keep coming out in film after film after film, but he keeps mixing up varying the mix to entrancing effect.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating that you're getting the same elements and often the same cast members even, and the same people behind the scenes, on these 6 productions, and yet they are so different. They pull away from each other. Maybe we'll never know, and that's all part of the interest and the intrigue.
So Martino started off, Sergio Martino, because there's more than one Martino involved in this. So Sergio started off in 1971 with The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward with an H, to prevent them being sued by a Mrs. Ward in Italy, I'm assuming. It's always one of those things where it was like when they translate it into English and they keep the Italian spelling of the surname. And you think, why have they done that? And it's like, because it was a legal thing. So like The Strange Vice, spoilers, it's sex. That's The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward.
Yeah, it's nothing to do with woodwork, folks. No. Sorry to disappoint you.
Sadly not, no. And it's basically it's a string of lovers from her past, the present, and future, in this case, form the basis of this plot. And it's your typical twisty-turny, giallo plot. And then thrown into the mix is a killer with black gloves and a fetish for razor blades, killing women across the town, and it is thought that she is one of her ex-lovers.
There's a quote from Freud at the beginning which says there could be a killer blooming within all of us. And I think he got it about right, because there's points in that plot where at least 4 different people are trying to kill Fennec with 4 different but possibly interconnected motivations.
Yeah, this sort of does a reverse on the psycho cliche, in that somebody is set up as the killer early on in the film, and then they die off. And you're as a viewer, you're left floundering, thinking what's coming next, and what does come next is outrageous, because as you say, there are sort of multiple suspects, and lots of strangeness as suggested by the title.
I think what I like about it is it doesn't have that sort of like mummy issues, childhood trauma element that is often the reasoning for the killer's motivations in this movie. That seems to be a trait among giallo movies.
It's a really transitional film, because towards the late 60s, the leading maker of gialli arguably was Umberto Lenzi, and his films were all about beautiful people shagging each other, swindling each other, killing each other. It was about the misdeeds of the international jet set, and it was usually inheritance-based. There was some kind of money trickery going on. But then along comes Bird with the Crystal Plume, and Argento's film, which is such a game changer. And that's all about somebody who's killing because they are sick in the head. They're twisted, there's something wrong with them. And it's very fetishistically, dressed and so on. But Mrs. Ward, it's a hybrid, because the beautiful people are still jet-setting around the world doing dodgy stuff, and there's an element of the twisted psycho killer. So I think the Martino organisation, I always imagined that Luciano was the real guy who made the decisions here, was sort of sitting on the fence about which way it was going to go. And in a lot of these films, you see this tension between the old Umberto Lenzi way of doing things. And Lenzi, in many ways, was supplanted by Martino as the rising star of giallo. And Lenzi had made these films for Luciano Martino. I guess it was cheaper to do things in-house and bring in your kid brother as the director, bring in your bedmate as the star and so on, and get rid of Carol Baker. But yeah, there's that tension between the two different ways of doing it. The sort of white telephone crew and all the stuff that they're getting up to, and then the psycho killers, and it becomes more and more as the cycle goes on. The Martino films, it's in Torso, it's really about the twisted psycho killer, and that in itself provides a template for subsequent American slasher movie and everything else that came after it.
Yeah, you've taken the words absolutely out of my mouth there, John. I was going to say precisely the same thing about the film, and where you'd got directors like Lucio Fulci at the time who were making films like Perversion Story, which seems like a sort of almost direct imitation of the Lenzi films with Carol Baker. And then you've got Martino here, who's actually making a transitional film, not just in his own career, because it's his first giallo and the first step in this little batch of films that we're talking about, but it's transitional for the whole sort of idea of Italian horror, in that it's taking that Lenzi template and kicking it forward, as you say, introducing the sort of razor-wielding psycho elements into that plot where we've got characters of upmarket social standing, they're moneyed, they're the beautiful people. In Lenzi's films, they're menaced by threatening blackmailers and people pushing people off balconies or pushing things off balconies onto people. And suddenly here we've got the psycho horror element being introduced in a big way, and I think that really does sort of shift things for Italian horror. So yeah, you can still what Martino's saying here, or the Martino brothers are saying, because as you say, I'm sure Luciano had a massive sort of influence on how these films looked and played. So what the Martino family is saying with this film is that you can have all of that style, and you can have the graphic murder that we've started seeing coming in from other corners of the Italian film industry. What happens if we cram those together? What do we get? And what we got was a film that, again, seemed to be influential over the next 10 or 15 years of Italian cinema.
Yeah, I mean, if it only did one thing, it established Edwige Fenech as the Queen of Giallo. At this point, she'd done $5 for an August Moon the previous year, but it was a very small hidden away role. It wasn't a keeper, but she became the face of Giallo for the next.
She really
years.
replaced Carol Baker as the queen of that, yeah, and was arguably never supplanted.
No, I mean, Edwige, for listeners who don't know her, look her up online. She's still around and still looks fabulous. She is born to be filmed by a movie camera.
Bit of interesting family background which feeds into this. Sergio Martino's grandfather was a guy called Gennaro Righelli, and he was a noted Italian director. He made the first Italian sound picture in 1922 with Sogno d'amore, Dream of Love. Now, Sergio's father was a banker, so there's these two strands going on in the family, the creativity and the business side of it. Luciano, who was the elder brother, he really went for the business side of it and became a very rich man. And Sergio was sort of younger, dashing sort of figure, and he was more the creative guy. But who ended up sharing their bed with Edwige? It was Luciano. So there's a moral out there for all of us to draw from.
It's a sexy movie, isn't it? This one, it's strange. They don't like ramp up the sexual content as the period goes on.
Yeah.
They come out of the gates with a very sexy. I mean, like there's S&M imagery in there. It goes full on with that kind of stuff.
I wonder, because it was refused certification when it was submitted to the BBFC in the early 70s. I wonder if they objected to the masochistic stuff or the straight violence or what have you. It's a real kind of don't do this kind of thing at home, kids. Don't roll around having sex in broken glass. It's probably not going to end well.
But of course, it's all sort of I don't know whether you'd call it essential to the plot, but it all sort of it all makes sense that all that stuff's in there by the end of the movie. It's not a film where you go away thinking that any of the sort of sexual imagery has been tacked on or just thrown in to grab the attention of the raincoat crowd or anything. It's all there for a purpose.
Yeah, it's not an inconveniently inserted shower scene, is it?
No,
or
no.
anything like that. It all ties into the motivations of the characters.
Martino used to shoot additional sex scenes and use them as a bargaining thing with the Italian censors, because they would take out stuff that he really frankly wasn't bothered about and leave in stuff that he did want in there. And apparently he's quite dismayed when he sees present day DVDs and Blu-rays, because they restore all of the stuff, and some of it he doesn't really regard as being an important part of the movie.
Well, as we said, they didn't mess around. They cranked out another one within the same year. I think Vice was early 1971, and Case was like August 71. Was released. Case of the Scorpion's Tail. As we discussed earlier, it is a much more by the numbers Giallo movie. It has the sort of like the globe-trotting elements that was like, oh, it's setting an exotic European city, let's do that. So it starts off in London and goes out to Athens. I think one of my favourite stories of European filmmakers positioning themselves, we need to get a sexy European city, and the desperate trying to find to distinguish them. We can't do Paris is already wrong. We can't do Rome, that's Argento's territory. And Jorge Grau for Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue came to Manchester, to his modern European city, took one look at it and went, I'm not filming in this shithole, and rewrote the entire thing so it takes place in the countryside. I think that's a
beautiful Derbyshire.
In beautiful
Very
Derbyshire,
nearby to where we're actually sitting now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good thing for us, but not so much as a comment on what Manchester was in 1975 or whatever it was.
He didn't manage to get in the guys with the masks, though. It was very prescient.
Yeah, so this one kicks off in London, but then soon shifts out to sun-drenched Athens. I think it's a really interesting film. I've just mentioned how the previous movie, Mrs. Ward, subverted the psycho trick. Well, Martino then sort of reverses that by playing the psycho trick and killing off Ida Galli, playing the character Lisa Baumer early on. After spending 20 minutes setting her up as the sort of Janet Leigh, the style heroine, she's out of the picture, violently slaughtered before we're half an hour in. And we've got no Edwidge Fenech either in this.
And it's sorely missed, I think.
She is, I think. Anita Strindberg does her best. And then, popped up in a few later Martino titles as well. But
Strindberg's a lot better in other movies than she is in this.
I think so. So she sort of comes off the subs bench after Ida Galli has been bumped off. But and again, we're into a sort of life insurance plot, and the words $1 million get mentioned quite a lot, as in classic Austin Powers style.
Have we got an Earthix plane blowing up?
Yeah, that incredible model shot. Which if Martino apologists might say, oh, he did that for stylistic reasons, but no, it's shot in his garage somewhere.
Yeah. A big influence on Luigi Cotz's career.
And 3.5 minutes into the film, 3.5 minutes in, we get a shot of a bottle of J&B, which I think is something. Again, purists will know exactly what we mean, but listeners who are new to the Giallo might need a bit of an explanation of what J&B is and why it appears in this film and so many other films. So, John, again, would you like to sort of take over on that?
Well, Justerini and Brooks are the manufacturers of whiskey for the international jet setters, for cool people who are shagging each other and killing each other in gialli. There's always... It happens in other films as well, crime films, horror films. There's a really notorious example in Bianchi's Burial Ground, where the waiter just virtually thrusts a bottle of J&B into your face.
Walks across the room into the foreground, and then the bottle's right there looming into the frame.
If you were a 24-hour party person in Italy during the early 70s, this is what you drank. And the company actually paid to have such outrageous product placement. It's become a byword. It's become a sort of kitschy joke. It's always great fun to see people knocking back the J&B.
Yeah. Now
I always have fun. I always feel like if I was going to make a British Jello now, I'd have like dandelion and burdock everywhere. D&B. It'd be D&B for breakfast.
Superb. Now, you were commenting on how this film's a little bit of a letdown in that it sort of retreads a lot of the elements.
It's a standalone Giallo. It's pretty good.
I think so. I think there's a lot to enjoy in Scorpion's Tale. For instance, Dario Argento's reputation has taken a little bit of a knock among some fans recently. I don't agree. I think Argento's the master of this sort of stuff. But as more and more of these films have become available in quality editions, people are starting to see scenes and saying, hang on, didn't Argento do that later on? There's a bit in this movie where we see the killer trying to break in through a door, and there's a brief couple of second shot where they shove a blade through a slot in the door and underneath the door latch. And Argento elaborates on that brilliantly in Suspiria some years later. But you saw it here first, folks, in Martino. There's a couple of fantastic shots in the film, I think. I love the one where George Hilton, a regular in these films, is being interrogated by the police. And it's all filmed from this weird sideways angle, like the camera's tilted. So the characters it's almost like they're lying backwards on a board or something. And then the camera sort of swings across the policeman's desk. It's absolutely marvellous. I can't think of anything like it in any other film. And my favourite shot in the film is one where Hilton is on the phone to the police at one point, and the shot is framed sort of through an open window. And one side of the frame, the right quarter of the frame, is a white sort of window slat with George Hilton on the phone in natural colours, natural skin tones. You can see all his clothes in their natural colours and everything. And then 3/4 of the frame is bathed in this gorgeous green light. And it's such a fabulous shot. So yeah, if they are sort of retreading a standard Giallo plot here, at least Martino is trying to imbue a bit of style into it, and do something with it. Even during the sort of finale, which is rather drawn out and rather basic, we get some lovely shots of the camera sort of snaking through and around these rocks as the sea sort of crashes in on the beach. And so I think there's some technique being added to this movie, even if it is sort of Giallo plot number 2.1 sort of thing.
It does show off his underrated talent of composing a shot in this movie, which he fully expands upon in All the Colours of the Dark, blending the psychosexual imagery from Vice and then the visuals that he brought into the case of Scorpion's Tale as well, mashed them together in a wonderful, outrageous, really visual movie in All the Colours of the Dark.
What do we think about the imagery of the killer in the case of Scorpion's Tale? Because it's your traditional black glove killer, but they're sort of dressed in black all over. Sergio's been watching one or two Mario Bava films, hasn't he? Because we get an inference of the brimmed hatted killer from the faceless killer from Blood and Black Lace. Mm-hmm. But there's a sort of scene where the killer is seen sort of dancing around on rooftops in a rather agile fashion, and he's not got the hat on, and there's a very, very sort of definite diabolique sort of feel to that as well, I think. So
one of Sergio's earliest jobs was being a production manager on the Whip and the Body, Bava's film.
Yeah.
And he always says he learned an incredible amount from Bava about economy of shooting, not shooting very much more than you needed to use, about fixing problems in the edit, just resourceful, coming up with, he was very influenced by Bava. And indeed, the sort of the female masochism theme of Whip and the Body obviously comes up again in Mrs. Ward.
Yeah, now, Adam, you were just launching into trying to get us to talk there about Tutti I colori del buio, to mangle the Italian title, All the Colours of the Dark.
Bravo.
And to re-quote Ian Corns from John's Giallo Pages mag, Ian mentions the opening scene of that film as a truly weird concoction of images: old hags dressed as clockwork dolls, an immensely pregnant woman, a disemboweled body, and a strange backward trek down a country lane in negative. So that's how the movie kicks off, and it then gets progressively weirder. I think, as we've already intimated, it's a sort of Rosemary's Baby rip-off, but it's very much also part of that whole sort of satanic witchcrafty thing that seemed to be going on in sort of 1970, 70, 71 and 72 in both fictional movies and a crop of documentaries that were coming out at the time. So Edwidge is back for this one, and we're in London for the whole thing this time as well. Interesting use of overhead shots in this one, especially of Kenilworth Court, where a lot of the action is set. And I think Sergio, like Fulci did at the same time with The Lizard in a Woman's Skin, here you've got a foreign director, and Sam Peckinpah, of course, did the same in Cornwall with Straw Dogs that same year. We've got foreign directors coming into London and coming into Britain and filming our locations in a rather unique way. So what do we think of Sergio Martino's London in this one?
I think it's great. I mean, as I said before, I think this is one of those movies that I come back to most of his movies. And yes, it is very similar. For me, very similar to Lizard in a Woman's Skin. The two kind of blur in my mind sometimes, where I'm not quite sure whether that scene is from this movie or that movie. It's just both great movies. And yeah, I mean, as much as we talk about Argento as being the guy, as you said earlier, he's not above stealing from other people. And I think there's a few things in this which crop up in Deep Red. You know, the broken skull, the broken doll imagery in this one. I think that's in this one. That he obviously repeats in Deep Red. Obviously, it's a great effect, but yeah, we get all kinds of stuff in this. It's like Let Loose, isn't it? With the hallucinations, the black masses, the whole thing. He's having a bit of fun, and that comes across on screen for me. Yeah,
I mean, we talked earlier about Martino's first two gialli, and particularly Mrs. Ward, as being a very transitional film and taking elements of that Umberto Lenzi style, but bringing the sort of razor-wielding killer into the mix as well. He sort of does the same here. What we've got here is a film that's right on the cusp. We've got the trappings of old horror. We've got witches, we've got the black masses, robes, chants, incantations, satanic symbols and so on. But what he does with all that stuff, which you've not really seen done before, is he transports it into modern-day London and makes it very clear that this is a character where people are travelling on the tube to get to their black masses. You know, they're not going there in a coach and horses. Yeah. And okay, you can say, well, Rosemary's Baby did that, but I don't think Rosemary's Baby quite had. What that was missing was the gothic trappings. You know, I think Sergio has introduced that. Rosemary's Baby was great, and then he said, okay, we're going to do a modern day witchcraft story, and we're going to make our witches look like your next door neighbour. And Sergio goes out of the window with that and says, no, I'm going to keep them in robes and with the sort of horns and skulls and things on the altars, but outside of that room where all that's going on, it's going to be London in 1972, and I'm going to make that very evident.
I think with some of these lower budget movies, you do get that time capsule element that you don't necessarily get with the bigger budget ones that are shot on sound stages and things like that. You get them walking through the streets of London. You get them establishing where they are, because look, there's Big Ben. We're in London. You get those sort of like shots of the streets that they managed to guerrilla shoot as they were doing it, and that really comes across in this movie. That sense of place, which I don't necessarily think. I think with Rosemary's Baby, I don't. You say it's the people next door. I don't live next door to any of those people in Rosemary's Baby, but I do. I can imagine myself living next to some of the people in All the Colours of the Dark.
You'd like to live next door to Edwidge. Well, is what you're saying. In terms of that location thing as well, it works as a time capsule specifically in one sense, in that I think at least one of the tube stations that Edwidge sort of passes through on her journey is one of these typical London journeys where I think people who actually live in London would say that bit and that bit and that bit don't join up. You know, you can't actually get on a train and go through all those stations.
Oh, mate, you want to take the Northern Line? Come on.
But I think at least one of these stations, I think Aldwych Station, has now closed down. So you're seeing something in use there.
Yes.
That is now a sort of relic. It's a ghost station. So watching that film is interesting from that sort of historical perspective. You know, Londoners that were around at the time will be able to sort of point at and say, oh, that's, you know, I remember travelling through there, you know, and you can't do it anymore.
I think also it's a socio-historical kind of time capsule because, like Fulci's Lizard in a Woman's Skin, it's revisiting what was swinging London, what was the summer of London, and what have you got now? You've got the sort of come down from acid. You've got paranoia. You've got the whole scene has turned sour.
Yeah, this is very much the tail end of swinging London. This is 1971,
bad
72.
hippies at this point,
Very, very much.
Yeah, I mean, for me, as I say, it's a ride. I enjoy it and I watch it again. I can see why it's not as highly regarded as some of his others. But the next film we go on to is probably the best regarded of his films, maybe. It was for many years. Is Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. It's arguably one of the greatest Giallo titles for a start. And
it actually references a line in Mrs. Wood, doesn't it? Because she slipped a note at some point where somebody makes this comment about her masochism, and then it becomes a full-blown film title in its own right.
Yeah, that's amazing. That should happen more often. You know, when you see things written on mirrors and so on, and notes slipped under doors, you know, people ought to turn those into film titles. And in this case, Sergio did, and he sort of ripped off himself. So, or ripped off Ernesto Castaldi, or Castaldi ripped off himself. What's interesting about this film is that in terms of Italian horror history, it almost seems that it's a rite of passage that every great Italian horror director had to film Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat at some point, or at least call a film The Black Cat. They've all done it. Fulci did it, Argento did it, Luigi Cozzi did it, you know. In this same year, Sergio Pastori made a great film called Crimes of the Black Cat, which is nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe, but it gets the Black Cat into the title. And here we've got this film outrageously called Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. But guess what, folks? It's a version of Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat.
And there were films that were way less true to the Poe story that went out with the title The Black Cat, you know, the Kotsu one in particular.
But what a film it is. I think it's my favourite Martino movie. And again, it's got Edwige Fenech, who comes in sort of halfway through this one and takes the film over, I think.
And she gets to play a bad girl.
Yeah, I don't like it. I don't like it, I'll be honest. I don't want to see Fish playing bad girls. I'm sorry. I'm there with it. I like her as a lead. I don't want to see her as bad girl.
It works for me.
But it has all those ingredients though. By that point, 72, you want in like drunken orgies, tick, we've got that. We've got sensual camera work, we've got Grizzly Murders, and of course
jaded misanthrope in the shape of Luigi Pistilli.
There you go.
And again, if All the Colours of the Dark was, as I said, a film that sort of takes those gothic trappings and brings them into the modern day, you know, this movie sort of expands on that by really combining gothic imagery with the sort of giallo style violence, and again it's another step forward. I think it's another step up that ladder for Martino in bringing all of these elements together, but making something new out of the combination.
And it's more of a chamber piece than the others, isn't it? Because they're not jetting off all over the world. They're just in this guy's little domain in
this very elaborate, you know, gorgeous looking sort of mansion. I suppose one of the most famous things about the movie, of course, is the scene towards the end, which Stanley Kubrick fans might be interested to note. The revelation that a writer who's supposedly been working on typing away a novel has actually been typing the same sentence or paragraph over and over and over again.
I've never seen that before or since.
So You know, we know Stanley Kubrick had his own private cinema. I suspect that a print of this movie might well have winged its way over to Kubrick Mansions.
When did King write the novel? It was probably after Strange.
It was.
Yes,
yeah.
it was. Yeah.
Your voice, yeah.
So yeah, if you're looking for more evidence of Martino being an influencer, it's right there. So no, I love the film, and I love the whole the business with the dress is great. The characters, all the female characters get to wear this really elaborate sort of period dress at one point, and that all plays into it. And how the plot of the Black Cat is worked into it all as well. It's all beautifully sort of knitted together by Castaldi. And
we keep sort of repeating, don't we, that it's the same old stuff, but it's always, you know.
Well,
it's not reheated, it's not rebaked. It's a kaleidoscopic, yeah.
I think it's one of those ones where I think I'm less fond of it. I think I tend to prefer female leads in my Jellos, and obviously this one doesn't. It has a male lead, and I think maybe that's why I'm less fond of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think what we have here is a lot of interesting female characters, but not in the lead. And as we say, Ed Weege sort of epitomises that by coming in halfway through instead of being on screen right from the start.
They've got to keep us guessing, haven't they?
Yeah. There's one absolutely wonderful scene that I love. When we showed this film at Quad a few years ago, and as part of one of the festivals here, and we were right in the middle of Britain coming in or going out of the EU campaign at the time, and there's a scene in a pavement cafe that's sort of nothing to do with the movie. It's just sort of thrown in as a bit of a filler, but characters having a conversation over coffee in a pavement cafe. And this is 1972, and their conversation is all about the benefits of European integration. And it was great watching that here in sort of 2017 or something, you know. And it's not panned out well for us, so maybe we need to go back and learn a few lessons from that cafe conversation. And also, I love the fact that Martino can actually grind the film to a complete halt at one point. When most European directors' films grind to a halt, and we're left sort of floundering and wondering what the hell's going on. Here, the plot sort of grinds to a halt, and instead of us getting 5 minutes of waffle, we cut to 5 minutes of really exciting motocross. And then we get that, and then suddenly Castaldi's inspiration kicks in again, and we're back to the plot, you know. But if we have to have a 5-minute interlude where nothing happens, I'd like to see people riding around in the mud on motorbikes, please.
Make mine motocross, yeah.
So again, arguably the most well-respected of Martino's movies. However, Torso came afterwards, which I remember when I first started watching these movies, late 90s, early 2000s. This was seen as one of the lesser ones, I felt. Yeah. But I think its reputation now has definitely gone through a reappraisal, whereas the point where now people reference it up at the top end of Sergio Martino's run.
I think the passage of time has done that, and the fact that it is arguably the most influential film on the American and Canadian slasher movie.
Would you put Bay of Blood in that as well as part of an influential?
Bay of Blood is very, very influential, but I think Bay of Blood always gets referenced because it influenced one specific film, which is Friday the 13th Part 2.
Whereas Torso is the formula, isn't it?
Torso is the absolute template for the hundreds of films that arrived between sort of 1978 and 85. That's the one that everybody was copying, and of course it got quite a wide American release as well. So I think people did genuinely see it and copy it.
And in the States, it double billed with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is in itself incredibly sort of indicative of how these films were going and what what was in the air.
Yeah, and it's known that Quentin Tarantino owns a print of Torso and has played it quite regularly at his sort of cinema film nights. Eli Roth is a big fan of it, and so you've got these influential names who know Torso inside out and love the film and champion it. And as we're suggesting, it's a fairly basic sort of masked killer slasher movie, but it's not without interest, I think.
We're getting into the slashers. We're getting into the have sex and die. We're getting into the stalk and slash. Yeah.
Talking of sex, and how, as we were talking about how weird the opening scene of All the Colours of the Dark was earlier on, what about the weird opening scene of this one?
Bonkers,
we've got this crazy sort of distorted, you can't quite tell what's going on,
photo
weird
session.
That sort of turns into a weird and very oddly shot sex scene, lots of naked writhing bodies, but not shown in a particularly erotic way, much more abstract and unfocused. And soundtracked by a very dry academic lecture that's coming from somewhere else, that we then cut to this sort of university hall and this lecturer delivering this scholarly talk. So what an odd way to kick the film off. If this was an influence on the American and Canadian slasher, I don't think they borrowed from that part of the film.
The opening, which is indicative of some sort of sexual malaise, certainly it pays off in the finale where we see the mother of all primal scenes, what motivated the killer, and the killer, as revealed, rants about women being dolls of flesh and blood, and there's a guy falling off a cliff. It's so over the top. It's priceless.
Yeah, of course, we've got the big local connection in this film as well. Belper girl Susie Kendall.
Yeah, if you can't get Fennec, then you get Susie Kendall, because she's certainly got some iconic genre baggage, hasn't she? Yeah,
we never stop championing Susie in Derby. And how great is she in this? Arguably, we're talking about this as the template for the American slasher movie. Here we've got the template for the final girl.
Yes.
I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm not a bigger fan of it. I mean, I enjoy it. Again, it's another one that I enjoy in the slasher mold. But what I always enjoy about Giallo movies is that the female characters in it tend to be women with jobs, women who actually do something. They're not teenagers bored at a camp, just having sex to pass the time. They are career women, or they are doing something with their lives. They are grown people. And I always find that way more interesting in these ones. So when they jump back to them being essentially students...
Sexy students. It
kind of was a bit of a disappointment for me as I was watching it first time. Obviously, that's changed over the years, because ultimately it changed the most when I actually saw it in the cinema with an audience, and it does take that audience on the ride. I think at some point the audience gives up trying to guess who the killer is, because there's just so many red herrings in that first half an hour, 45 minutes. You think there's no point trying to guess who it is. You might as well just go along for the ride, and as soon as that happens, I think you can fully engage with it.
And of course, a lot hangs on the guy who was obviously the killer and had a scarf. Was it a red pattern on a black background, or a black pattern on a red background? There's a lot of angsting about that.
Yeah. Now the set piece scene I love. It's during the extended finale with Susie Kendall being pursued by the killer. It's a variation on that old. You're inside a locked room, and you've got to knock the key out of the lock and sort of pull it back through the other side. The variation, the little spin on that, I think, is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, that is the moment of genius. Yeah, I mean, literally, when we screened it, I was sat next to a friend of the podcast, Dominic Burns, and he literally just grabbed my arm and went, "That is brilliant."
Because as the scene begins and you see what's happening, your eyes roll and your mind sort of says, "Oh no, not this old one again." And then they put the spin on it, which we won't reveal, and you do just go, "Yeah, that's fantastic."
That's the scene that stands out for me more than anything, I think. But yeah, as I say, I think it has grown in its influence over the years, and now we're seen as one of the top ones, if not the top one of this run of Giallo. And it was the last one at the end of a very intense period where 71, 72 and 73 made 5 Giallo movies, you know, so they weren't messing around in this period. And then the 6th Giallo comes along a couple of years later, dare I say, at the fag end of the Giallo genre. 1975, we do get Profunda Rosso, I guess arguably the final word on Giallo at that point. But we get Sergio Martino's final word on Giallo, which is not a great word on Giallo, I guess. It's an unusual movie, and is often discounted as a Giallo.
Yeah. Well, again, though, to put a positive spin on that, it's yet another film on the cusp. It's yet another movie that's trying to marry the past and the future of Italian cinema in combining Giallo elements with a very broad comedy, which doesn't always transfer outside of Italy and maybe didn't even play all that well within Italy, but also with elements of the new breed of police movie that was just starting to come through in Italy in the mid-70s.
And reflecting actual events in Italy at the time.
Yeah, so we've got the Poliziotesco movie, and also, as you say, John, the political and terrorist sort of activity that was going on in Italy. So yeah, I think Suspicious Death of a Minor, it's probably the worst of these 6 films, but I think it fits in that it does the same as all the others, in that it ties together different elements of Italian cinema, and it borrows from the past, but it also has an eye on what's coming next. And Martino always seemed very, very good at doing that.
Yeah, do you think in this one, is it that, or is it that Sergio's spreading himself so thin at this point that he's falling back on comfort zones in some ways, so he can shoot Italian sex comedies in his sleep at this point? He's made a handful of those, and has done, and he's just been making The Violent Professionals around this period as well, isn't it? So he's moving into the Poliziesecchi type of film as well. Is it a case of this one's not quite firing on all cylinders and he just falls back on some of those comfort zones?
I think he's got an eye to the way the market is going, and probably more importantly, his big brother, financier, producer, Luciano, has got an eye to how the market is going, and they're trying to judge it, and maybe they don't quite get it right. Certainly I think there are children being trafficked into prostitution or something in this film, and yet you get a car chase during which a guy on a cycle is sort of dodging the cars, and then he's riding around on a motorcycle, and it makes...
Don't forget the man who spins around on his head twice.
Oh, yeah.
That happens as well in that sequence.
It's crazy, and they're going for the comedy. It just doesn't really work, and I think in all good faith they probably tried to make it work, but it doesn't reflect the former glories. It's not of a piece with those that we've been
tonally,
talking about.
It's all over the place, isn't it? Yeah. I think one of the interesting things was, a lot of the Giallo movies, their depictions of the police, it is well regarded as they depict them as bungling oafs. They are not capable of investigating these crimes. So it is the amateur detective that inevitably ends up taking up the baton of trying to figure out who it is.
Interestingly, what we've got here is Claudio Cassinelli playing that type of character, but then there's the reveal halfway through the movie that he is actually in the police force, and it comes as a big surprise to some of the other characters. But although he's in the force, they do play very much on that. He's an outsider. He's sort of going off and doing his own thing.
Harry Callahan sort of guy.
There is an element of that sort of maverick cop thing, but there's a real element of trying to disguise to the audience the fact that he's in the police as well until some way into the movie.
To be fair, for me, he's one of the plus points of the film.
Yes, he is.
I think he's incredibly charismatic in this movie, more so than George Hilton, I think. He's definitely you feel like you're going on the journey with him. He does miss a strong female lead. The women are all just ciphers to move on to the next plot. They're victims or they're ciphers to move you on to the next bit of the plot.
I think in his best films, Martino does have strong female characters, and they're missing here.
Adam, you were talking about the sort of tonal shifts in this and how none of it fits together, and I'd agree with that. There is proof that it's actually possible to pull that off. I love the British TV show The Sweeney, which was a contemporary of this movie, you know. And I think there are certain episodes of The Sweeney that actually manage to pull off all of the elements that Martino's trying to put into this. Gritty action, violence, cynicism, a particular view of the police, and knockabout comedy. I don't think Martino manages it here, though. I'm not even sure the comedy travelled even within Italy, never mind outside.
I think it's tricky to try and make a film that is ostensibly about the trafficking of young women, underage women, and then have comedy sequences in it. It's a tricky one to try and marry the two together, and they try their hardest, but they don't. And it's not just a knockabout comedy as well. Some of the deaths in the movie are unexpected for the sake of being unexpected, and you feel like you didn't. I don't want to spoil the film for people, but a certain character gets killed fairly late on in the movie. When you feel like the film's dying down, and it's suddenly it's there as a plot device to kick the character on again.
Yeah. Every half hour, and often at random and almost to sort of punctuate the movie, we get a horror murder, and they don't really fit in, do they?
No.
I think in a career as distinguished as Martino's, we can forgive him the odd misfire.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to discuss this film along with the other five, because it does form part of the little group. If you want to distance it, we've got the years distance between this and the other five films, but it is a Martino giallo, and I think as such it's an interesting and important film. It's just not as good as the other five. Absolutely.
And just to point out, this is not about suspicious deaths at the miners' strikes. Completely different type of miner.
It's OR at the end, not ER. Yeah. Although maybe Suspicious Death of a member of the NUM might have been a slightly better movie. I don't know.
Suspicious BBC newsroom re-editing of the augury of situation.
File as potential idea for a future film. Well, that wraps up our run through of Sergio's 6 giallo movies. He didn't stop there. He carried on making movies for another 20 years or so. But that is a tale for another podcast. Thank you very much again to the BFI and Quad for supporting these podcasts, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks' time. Take care.